They didn't come with world-ending lasers or grand booming declarations from the sky. The vile empire just showed up on a Tuesday, slapped cold, heavy metal collars on our necks, and handed us shovels. For 1,000 years, their protocol worked perfectly on every species they discovered. Break the spirit collar, the neck harvest the world. But they made one catastrophic mistake. They didn't read our history. They didn't realize that for humans, peace is a fragile, temporary concept, and violence is practically a reflex. The smell was the first thing that set Caleb's teeth on edge. It wasn't the stench of death or the sulphurous brimstone of a cinematic hell. It was worse. It smelled like a hospital waiting room at 3 a.m, sterile ammonia, sharp ozone, and the sour, unmistakable undertone of human terror. He knelt on the grated steel floor of the processing ship, his knees bruised and aching. The metal was freezing, biting through the thin fabric of his jeans. Around him, hundreds of others knelt in identical, shivering rows. No one spoke. The silence was thick, punctuated only by the wet sound of someone trying to quietly clear their throat or the sharp intake of breath as the overseers walked past. The Vile didn't look like monsters. They were tall, impossibly slender, their skin a flawless matte slate gray. They wore seamless white garments that looked halfway between armor and a laboratory-clean suit. They moved with a disturbing, fluid grace, their elongated faces devoid of anything recognizable as empathy or malice. To them, this wasn't a conquest. It was a logistical operation, a spreadsheet. Caleb's throat was dry. He swallowed, and it felt like sandpaper rubbing together. He kept his eyes locked on the scuffed toe of his right boot. "Just keep your head down," he told himself. "Don't look up. Don't make them notice you." A soft pneumatic hiss echoed down the line. It was the sound of the collars locking into place. A Vial halted in front of Caleb. He saw the hem of the pristine white suit, the grey four-fingered hand, holding a thick half-circle of matte black metal. Caleb's breath hitched. He wanted to run. Every nerve ending in his body screamed at him to scramble backward, to throw a punch, to do something. Instead, his muscles locked in a pathetic, paralyzing freeze. He squeezed his eyes shut. Cold metal brushed his throat. A secondary piece snapped against the back of his neck. Click hiss. It was heavy. It rested on his collarbones like a yoke, the inner lining digging slightly into his Adam's apple. The front of it emitted a faint, pulsing blue light. "Stand." The voice didn't come from the veil. It came from the collar, vibrating directly against Caleb's jawbone in a flat, synthesized English. Caleb stood. His legs wobbled. 2 rows ahead, a man lost his nerve. He was older, maybe in his 50s, wearing a torn flannel shirt. He bolted. He didn't run toward the veil. He just ran blindly toward the featureless grey bulkheads, a panicked, wordless sound tearing from his throat. The veil didn't chase him. The overseer simply tapped a small flat device on its wrist. The man's collar flashed from blue to a searing, angry red. The sound was what Caleb would remember for the rest of his life. A sharp, loud crack, like a heavy tree branch snapping in half. The man went rigid, his arms flying outward, fingers splayed in unnatural stiffness. He hit the grating face first, his nose breaking with a wet crunch that turned Caleb's stomach. The man convulsed once, twice, and then lay perfectly still. A thin wisp of grey smoke curled from the back of his neck. The smell hit a second later, coppery blood evacuated bowels, and the distinct, horrific stench of burnt pork. Caleb clamped a hand over his mouth, dropping to his knees as his stomach heaved. He vomited pale, acidic bile onto the steel grate. He squeezed his eyes shut, tears of pure, undiluted cowardice, and relief stinging his vision. "It wasn't me," he thought, hating himself for the clarity of it. It wasn't me. The Veil Overseer didn't even look at the corpse. It moved to the next row. "Remove the biological waste," the synthesized voice hummed over the ship's PA. 2 mechanical drones, humming softly, descended from the ceiling to drag the man away. That was day 1. The Vial thought they had demonstrated the absolute futility of resistance. They thought the silence in the room was the sound of submission. They were wrong. It wasn't submission. It was shock. And beneath the shock, buried under the terror and the vomit and the cold metal, was a hot, ugly seed of spite. The Vial operated on a binary logic pane, equals compliance. They didn't understand that for humans, trauma doesn't just break you. It twists you into something meaner. By the second day, they were in the mines. They called it a processing facility, but it was a strip mine carved into the crust of a dead, airless moon. The atmosphere inside the atmospheric dome was breathable, but choked with fine, abrasive silica dust that coated Caleb's teeth and turned his sweat into a gritty paste. The work was brutal manual labor. The Vial had advanced robotics, but they used biologicals for the unpredictable, delicate extraction of crystalline veins that machines tended to shatter. It was cheaper to burn through slave labor than to recalibrate their drones. Caleb swung a heavy kinetic pickaxe into the rock wall. His shoulders screamed. Blisters had formed, popped and reformed on his palms within the first 6 hours. Next to him worked a woman named Hannah. She looked like she used to be a mechanic, or maybe a contractor. Broad shoulders, dirt smeared across her forehead, eyes like chipped flint. On his other side was Arthur, a soft-spoken accountant who looked like he was one missed heartbeat away from a stroke. The Veil Overseers walked the catwalks above them, silent sentinels watching the quota numbers tick up on their data pads. If your quota dropped, your collar turned yellow. It delivered a low-voltage shock, not enough to kill, but enough to make your teeth rattle and your muscles spasm. Arthur's collar flashed yellow. The older man dropped his pick, gasping, as the current ripped through him. He fell to his knees, shivering. Caleb froze, looking up at the catwalk. The Veil was watching, impassive. "Get up, Arthur!" Hannah hissed her voice, a low, gravelly rasp. "Come on, grab the handle." "I can't," Arthur wheezed. "My chest. Grab it." Caleb found himself saying, his voice cracking. He bent down, grabbing Arthur by the back of his shirt, hauling the older man to his feet. Caleb swung his own pick, then reached over and swung Arthur's, chipping a loose rock into the collection bin. The yellow light on Arthur's neck blinked back to blue. The Veil moved on. "They don't look at us," Hannah muttered, swinging her tool with a rhythmic mechanical precision. "What?" Caleb panted. "The grey bastards. They don't look at us. They look at the numbers. They look at the screens." She paused, wiping a streak of muddy sweat from her cheek. They expect perfect compliance, machine logic, input-output. So they don't know what to do with friction, she said softly. Caleb watched her. Over the next 3 hours he realized what she meant. Hannah wasn't just mining. She was subtly, beautifully breaking things. When she loaded the conveyor belt, she intentionally placed the heaviest, sharpest rocks on the outer edge, causing the rubber track to fray slightly against the guardrail. When she took a mandated hydration break, she unscrewed the cap of her water ration, just enough so it dripped directly onto the circuitry of the hydration station. It wasn't a riot, it was 1,000 tiny paper cuts. Caleb looked around. Others were doing it too. A young guy down the line was kicking dust into the exhaust vents of the cooling units every time a drone looked away. A woman further down was intentionally misaligning the collection bins, causing a micro-jam every 100 cycles. The Vial logistics system began to stutter. Drones scrambled to fix the minor jams. The temperature in the mine rose 2 degrees as the vents clogged. The overseers on the catwalks paced faster, their movements losing that fluid, arrogant grace replaced by twitchy confusion. They shocked people, yes, but the quotas still lagged, because the machines were fighting back too. It was a uniquely human realization. If you can't blow up the factory, you throw a wrench in the gears. If you don't have a wrench, you use your own blood and bone. But the vial adjusted. An overseer descended from the catwalk, flanked by 2 armed combat drones. It walked directly toward Arthur. The algorithm had identified the weakest link in their sector. Unit 84 Delta. The Veil's translator buzzed. Efficiency at 32%. Unacceptable variance. "I'm trying!" Arthur gasped, backing up. The vial didn't shock him. It simply raised a long, telescoping baton and struck Arthur across the ribs. The sound of fracturing bone was loud in the enclosed cavern. Arthur collapsed, screaming, clutching his side. Caleb's vision tunneled. The fear was still there, cold and heavy in his stomach, but something else flared up alongside it. It was a hot, blinding surge of adrenaline. It tasted like copper. He gripped the handle of his kinetic pick, his knuckles turning white. He shifted his weight, calculating the distance between the heavy iron head of his tool and the smooth, grey skull of the overseer. Hannah's hand shot out, clamping around Caleb's wrist with astonishing force. Not yet. She breathed, her eyes locked on his. Not here. You'll die, and they'll just clean up the mess. Caleb shook his breath, coming in ragged gasps. He lowered the pick. The overseer stared at them for a long moment, a blank, unreadable gaze, before turning and walking away. Drones dragged Arthur to the medical bay, not to heal him, but to inject him with enough stimulants to make him work through the broken bones. Caleb looked at Hannah. His hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the violent, suppressed urge to tear the veil apart with his bare teeth. "Tonight," Hannah whispered, turning back to the rock wall. "Tonight we cut the strings." The barracks were a masterclass in psychological deprivation. A massive, cavernous room filled with hundreds of tiered metal slabs. No mattresses. No blankets. Just cold steel and the oppressive, damp smell of unwashed bodies pressed too close together. The lights were dimmed to a sterile twilight grey. The only illumination came from the hundreds of soft blue rings around their necks. Caleb sat on his slab, his legs pulled to his chest. His body ached in ways he didn't know were possible. Beside him, Hannah was awake, staring intently at the pulsing blue light on her own chest. "It's a closed circuit," Hannah whispered, her voice barely audible over the collective breathing of 500 exhausted humans. She had a small, jagged piece of metal in her hand, a shard she had snapped off a ventilation grate earlier. I watched the drones charge them in the racks on day 1. The failsafe isn't digital. It's an analog breaker to prevent the collars from shorting out during plasma storms. Caleb stared at her. English Hannah. "If you overload the grounding node right here," she tapped a small flat square on the inside of the collar just above her clavicle. "The internal fuse pops. The collar dies. It doesn't send a signal to the network, because it thinks it's protecting itself from an environmental surge." "And if you're wrong," Caleb asked, his heart hammering, "then it triggers the execution protocol and my head pops off like a dandelion." She said it matter-of-factly, adjusting her grip on the metal shard. "But if we don't do this, Arthur dies tomorrow, and you'll die the day after." She didn't ask for permission. She leaned back against the metal wall to ground herself. She pressed the sharp edge of the metal shard into the seam of the collar, right against the flesh of her neck. "If I start screaming," she whispered, "cover my mouth." Caleb nodded, his hands shaking as he hovered them over her face. Hannah took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and shoved the metal shard hard into the node. There was a sharp snap, loud as a firecracker. Blue sparks showered over Hannah's chin. Her entire body went rigid, her back arching violently off the metal slab. A low, strangled, guttural noise tore from her throat. Caleb slammed his hands over her mouth, muffling the sound, his own eyes wide with panic. He could smell it immediately. The bitter tang of ozone and the sickening sweet smell of burning hair and roasting flesh. The collar turned a blinding, furious white, then flashed red, and finally, it went dark. Hannah collapsed back onto the slab, gasping for air against Caleb's hands. She was trembling violently. Caleb slowly pulled his hands away. A severe second-degree burn blistered across her collarbone, the skin blackened and weeping. But the collar was a dull, dead black. She looked up at him, tears streaming down her soot-stained face, and bared her teeth in a savage, agonizing smile. "It's heavy," she gasped, her voice raw. "But it's dead." Word spread through the dark. It wasn't organized through telepathy or grand speeches. It was the whispered, desperate communication of a species backed into a corner. Pass the metal down. Bite on a piece of leather. Hold them down so they don't thrash. Caleb took the jagged shard from Hannah. It was warm, slick with her blood and sweat. He stared at the blue light illuminating his own chin. The terror was overwhelming. He was a logistics manager. He drove a sedan. He bought organic coffee. He wasn't built for this. He looked around the barracks. In the dim light, he saw the blue rings winking out one by one. Pop! 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 Small sparks of rebellion in the dark. He saw people biting down on their own arms to stop from screaming, smelled the rising stench of burnt flesh that filled the room like incense. They were mutilating themselves willingly, just to spite their captors. Caleb placed the shard against his neck. The metal was cold against his sweat-slick skin. He leaned back against the steel bulkhead. Don't think. Just push. He shoved the shard in. The pain wasn't a sensation. It was an absolute erasure of the world. 1,000 volts of raw electricity locked every muscle in his body simultaneously. His jaw clamped shut with enough force to crack a molar. He tasted blood and pennies. White fire exploded behind his eyes, and his lungs seized, unable to expel the air trapped inside them. He felt his flesh cooking, searing hot and agonizing against his throat. And then, just as he felt his consciousness slipping into the dark, it stopped. Caleb slumped forward, dry heaving violently. His neck felt like it was wrapped in barbed wire and set on fire. He touched his throat with trembling fingers, wincing as he brushed the raw, blistered skin. He looked down. The blue light was gone. He was still wearing the collar. It still looked exactly the same to a passing drone or a distracted Vial overseer on a catwalk. But it was just a piece of iron now. Caleb looked up. The barracks were still. Out of 500 humans in this sector, 400 had gone dark. The remaining 100 were too young, too old, or too afraid. Hannah sat up slowly, wiping a smear of blood from her chin. She looked at Caleb, then out at the sea of darkened collars. "Tomorrow," Caleb whispered, his voice sounding like broken glass, the cynicism stripped away, leaving nothing but cold, pragmatic malice. Hannah nodded. "Tomorrow we don't dig." The dawn of day 3 was 6 hours away. The Vial Empire was about to learn that you can leash a dog, but if you don't feed it, it will eventually realize you're made of meat. The morning of day 3 began with a localized, agonizing throb at the base of Caleb's throat. When the harsh halogen lights of the barracks snapped on, he didn't stretch or yawn. He just opened his eyes and stared at the steel grating of the bunk above him. The burn on his neck felt like a branding iron had been left to cool against his skin. Every time he swallowed, The dead collar shifted against the blistered flesh, sending sharp, bright spikes of pain down his spine. He sat up slowly, his joints popping. Around him, the barracks were a study in silent collective trauma. 500 people rising from metal slabs. The air was stale thick with the smell of dried sweat and the lingering coppery ghost of scorched skin. He glanced at Hannah. She looked awful. Her face was hollowed out, dark circles bruising the skin under her eyes. Her lips cracked and dry. The collar rested heavy on her charred collarbone, completely dark. She met his gaze. There was no heroic nod, no cinematic spark of defiance. She just looked tired. Tired and mean. The automated blast doors hummed open. The veiled drones floating spherical metallic husks with glowing optical sensors hovered into the room, their synthesized voices blaring the morning mandates. Proceed to Transit Corridor Beta. Hydration cycle in 10 minutes. Quota deficit will be met with maximum penalty. Caleb fell in line. He kept his chin tucked, letting the shadow of his jaw obscure the dead black metal of his collar. He noticed others doing the same. It was a pathetic shuffling march, a column of broken livestock heading to the slaughter. Or so it looked. They passed through the primary security archway. This was the choke point. The archway emitted a low, humping frequency, scanning the network for the active RFID tags in their collars. Caleb's breath hitched in his chest. His palms, already slick with nervous sweat, closed into fists. If the archway looked for a return ping, he was dead. He stepped through. The frequency vibrated in his teeth. Nothing happened. The Veil software was designed for efficiency, not anomaly. It registered 500 biological units passing through the checkpoint. It counted the ambient signals from the active collars, the 100 who hadn't taken the shard, and simply mathematically extrapolated the mass. The system couldn't comprehend that a biological unit would intentionally sever its own neural restraint link. It was a blind spot the size of a gas giant. They rode the freight elevator down into the silica-choked belly of the moon. The descent took 10 minutes. 10 minutes of listening to the grinding gears, the hydraulic hiss, the ragged breathing of the people, packed shoulder to shoulder in the cage. Caleb stared at the back of the neck of the man in front of him. Miller, a retired postal worker. His collar was active, pulsing a soft, oblivious blue. Miller hadn't had the nerve to use the metal shard. Caleb felt a sudden, crushing weight of guilt in his stomach. The elevator hit the bottom with a teeth-rattling thud. The doors grated open, letting in the abrasive, dust-filled air of the mine. The overseers were waiting. 6 Vial tall and pristine, in their white environmental suits, flanked by 4 combat drones, equipped with non-lethal sonic pacifiers and lethal thermal lances. Proceed to sectors 4 through 9. The lead Vial droned through its translator. Deficit recovery begins immediately. They fanned out. Caleb picked up his kinetic pickaxe. It was heavy, the iron handle slick from yesterday's grime. He walked to the rock wall, feeling the grit crunch under his boots. He took a swing. The kinetic charge in the axe head fired, cracking the stone. The vibration traveled up his arms, jarring his shoulders. He swung again, and again. He watched the veil out of the corner of his eye. They paced the catwalks. They didn't carry traditional firearms. They carried sleek, datapod-like devices that controlled the local network, the drones, the mining equipment, the collars. They were middle management with the power of life and death. 2 hours passed. The tension in the cavern was a physical thing. It felt like the air before a thunderstorm, heavy and suffocating. Then Arthur faltered. The older man was 3 paces to Caleb's left. He had been laboring under the broken ribs from yesterday, his breathing a wet, shallow rattle. He swung his pick, missed the vein, and the recoil twisted his torso. Arthur dropped the tool with the strangled cry, falling to his knees. He coughed, spitting a bright red string of blood into the grey dust. On the catwalk above the lead, Vial paused. It tapped its datapad. Arthur's collar, which was still active, pulsing blue, suddenly flashed yellow. The low-voltage shock ripped through him, and Arthur screamed a thin, reedy sound that cut through the grinding noise of the mine. The Veil tapped the screen again. The collar went red. Unit 84 Delta. Biological failure imminent. Commencing termination to clear the workspace. Caleb didn't think. The civilized, rational part of his brain, the part that managed spreadsheets, paid taxes, and stopped at red lights, simply snapped off. In its place roared something primitive, dark, and utterly devoid of hesitation. He didn't yell. He didn't issue a battle cry. He just turned, planted his back foot in the silica dust, and threw his kinetic pickaxe like a javelin. It was a clumsy, desperate throw. But the heavy iron tool, augmented by its kinetic battery, tumbled end over end through the dusty air. The Vial overseer didn't even look up. It had no localized threat detection for a biological slave. It was a statistical impossibility. The heavy, blunt end of the pickaxe slammed into the Veil's chestplate. The impact sounded like a car crash. The ceramic armor cracked loudly, and the kinetic charge discharged on impact, a concussive boom that shattered the alien's ribs. The Veil was thrown backward off the catwalk, its arms flailing with a sudden, very ungraceful panic. It plummeted 20 feet, landing on the steel grating below, with a sickening, wet crunch. The mine went entirely perfectly silent. The ambient noise of the machines seemed to fade into a vacuum. Caleb stood, frozen, his arms still raised from the throw. He was panting, his chest heaving. He looked down at his empty hands, then up at the broken, twitching body of the alien on the floor. Viscous clear fluid, Vial blood smelling sharply of ammonia, began to pool around its crushed helmet. I just killed it. Caleb thought, the reality hitting him like a physical blow. Oh my God, I just killed it. For exactly 3 seconds, nothing happened. The Veil on the catwalks stared down at their fallen superior. The combat drones hovered, awaiting a network command. The human slaves stared at Caleb. Then the remaining 5 Vial realized what had occurred. Their elongated faces didn't contort with rage. They simply processed the data. A localized revolt. The protocol was absolute and immediate. The Vial tapped their datapads simultaneously, triggering the mass execution override for Sector 4. All across the cavern, 100 active collars flashed from blue to searing red. The sound was apocalyptic. 100 simultaneous neck-snapping cracks echoed off the stone walls. Miller, the retired postal worker, stiffened, his eyes rolling back in his head as the localized charge blew out his spinal column. He fell face forward into the dust smoke curling from his neck. Beside him, a young woman in a torn hoodie collapsed, her limbs jerking in chaotic spasms. 100 people died in the span of a single heartbeat, dropping like cut marionettes, but 400 people did not. 400 collars remained dead, black, and useless. The Vials stared at their datapads, then down at the 400 humans who were still standing. For the first time in their 1,000-year history of subjugation, the Veil experienced a systemic failure. And for the first time, Caleb saw something recognizable on their smooth gray faces. Confusion, followed rapidly by terror. "Kill them!" Hannah roared, her voice tearing her throat bloody. The spell broke. The mine erupted into absolute, unadulterated chaos. It wasn't a coordinated military assault. It was a prison riot on a planetary scale. 400 starving, beaten, terrified humans surged forward like a tidal wave of flesh and bone. The combat drones reacted first. One swiveled its thermal lance, cutting a blindingly bright line of heat across the floor. It caught a man in the chest, bisecting him instantly. The smell of flash-vaporized blood hit the air thick and nauseating. But the drones were designed for crowd control, targeting individual heat signatures. They weren't programmed to fight a swarm of bodies that didn't care if they died. 10 people tackled the first drone. They didn't have weapons. They used their bare hands, grabbing the burning hot exhaust vents, screaming as their flesh seared but refusing to let go. They dragged the floating machine down into the dirt, burying it under a pile of heavy, thrashing bodies. A woman grabbed a discarded kinetic pick and brought it down like an executioner's axe, smashing the drone's optical sensor into a shower of sparks and broken glass. Caleb was in the thick of it, moving on pure instinct. The civilized man was dead. He scrambled up the metal stairs toward the catwalk, his boots slipping on the clear, stinking Vael blood pooling on the grating. A Vael overseer raised a telescopic baton, swinging it at Caleb's head. Caleb ducked, feeling the air rush past his ear. He tackled the alien around the waist. The Vael was tall, but incredibly light, its bone density built for a lower gravity world. They hit the catwalk, grating together. The alien's hands, cold and incredibly strong, clamped around Caleb's throat, right over his blistered burn. Caleb screamed, black spots dancing in his vision as the pressure cut off his air. He thrashed blindly his hand, finding a loose, heavy iron bolt that had sheared off a railing during the chaos. He gripped it. He didn't think about the morality of it. He didn't think about his soul. He just swung the bolt upward, smashing it into the side of the Vael's smooth grey skull. The alien shrieked a high, piercing, digital-sounding noise. Its grip loosened. Caleb scrambled to his knees, gasping for air, and brought the bolt down again. And again. And again. The ceramic helmet cracked, then shattered. The clear blood sprayed across Caleb's face, stinging his eyes and burning his lips with the taste of ammonia. He kept swinging until his arm went numb, and the Vael stopped moving. He dropped the bolt, collapsing against the railing. His chest heaved, his lungs burning as they pulled in the dust-choked air. He wiped the alien blood from his eyes with a trembling hand, looking out over the cavern. The fighting was over. It had taken less than 4 minutes. The 6 Vael overseers were dead, beaten to a pulp by tools and bare fists. The 4 combat drones were sparking crushed piles of metal. The human toll was devastating. 100 executed by the collars. Another 30 killed by the drone's thermal lances or crushed in the stampede. The floor of the mine was a slaughterhouse, a horrific mixing of red human blood and clear Vael fluid, turning the grey silica dust into a thick, foul-smelling mud. People were weeping. Some were wandering, aimlessly shell-shocked, clutching broken arms or nursing severe burns. A man sat by the bisected corpse of his friend, rocking back and forth, emitting a low, continuous wail. Caleb looked at his hands. They were coated in clear, sticky fluid. He felt a sudden, violent urge to vomit, but his stomach was completely empty. He just dry heaved over the railing, his body violently rejecting the reality of what he had become. Hannah climbed the stairs, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had a gash over her left eye, blood streaming down the side of her face. She walked over to the Vael Caleb had killed, reaching down to pry the datapad from its limp grey fingers. She looked at Caleb. Her eyes were hard, the flinty surface hiding whatever terror she was feeling. "Get up," she said. Her voice wasn't heroic. It was flat, mechanical, and desperate. "If we stay here, we die." The silence that followed the massacre was worse than the noise of the battle. It was heavy, accusatory. The grinding of the mining drills had stopped. The only sounds were the weeping of the survivors and the erratic dying sparks of a crushed drone. Caleb pulled himself up by the railing. His legs felt like lead. Every muscle in his body vibrated with a terrifying, exhausting cocktail of adrenaline and horror. He wiped his mouth, spitting a glob of metallic-tasting saliva over the edge. "They'll send more," Caleb croaked. "No," Hannah said, tapping the Vial datapad with a blood-smeared thumb. "The network is heavily compartmentalized. Hubris. They don't have a planetary alarm for slave revolts because it's never happened. This datapad is throwing a local error code. To the central spire, it looks like a localized cave-in and a communications blackout." "How long until they send a maintenance crew to check it out?" asked a woman who had followed Hannah up the stairs. She was holding a heavy wrench, her knuckles white. 2 hours. Maybe 3. Hannah muttered, her eyes scanning the glowing alien glyphs. "But they'll lock the freight elevators from the top down the second they realize the biologicals aren't buried." Caleb looked around. They had about 270 people left who could walk. Most were civilians. Accountants, teachers, mechanics, cooks. They were bruised, burned, and terrified. They had kinetic pickaxes, iron bars, and the heavy wrenches used to fix the conveyor belts, against an empire that conquered worlds before breakfast. "We need weapons," Caleb said. It surprised him how steady his voice sounded, even though his knees were shaking. He pointed to the dead Vial guards. "Can we use their thermal lances? The drone guns?" "Biometrically locked," Hannah replied, kicking a broken drone. "The trigger mechanisms read the vascular patterns of the veil. You pick it up, it locks down. We have rocks and mining tools. Then we go up," Caleb said. He looked at the massive, reinforced steel doors of the main freight elevator. "We go up into the processing hub. If they think this is a cave-in, they aren't waiting for us at the top." Hannah nodded, tapping a sequence into the datapad. "I have the clearance codes for the lift from this overseer. But Caleb, once we go up, there's no hiding. The hub is sterile, clean. They have a garrison of automated security up there. If we step off that elevator, we are committing to taking the entire facility." "What's the alternative?" Caleb asked, gesturing to the graveyard below them. "We stay down here and starve, or wait for them to vent the oxygen from the mine." Hannah didn't argue. She turned to the crowd below. "Listen up!" she yelled, her voice echoing sharply. "Grab anything heavy, anything sharp. If you can walk, you get in the cage. We're going to the surface." The survivors moved like ghosts. They stripped the dead of anything useful: water rations, medical patches, heavy boots. Caleb watched a man gently close the eyes of the retired postal worker, then pry the dead man's kinetic pickaxe from his stiffening fingers. The grief was there, raw and bleeding, but it was being pushed down, compressed into a hard, dense core of absolute necessity. They packed into the massive freight elevator. It was designed to haul hundreds of tons of ore, so it fit the survivors easily. The smell inside the cage was horrific: sweat blood, burnt flesh, and the sharp ammonia tang of the dead aliens. No one spoke. The silence was absolute. Hannah plugged the Veil datapad into the elevator's control console. She bypassed the standard biometric scan using the Overseer's override token. Click. Clunk. Hiss. The massive hydraulic engines groaned to life. The cage shuddered, then began its slow, agonizing ascent. Caleb leaned against the cold steel mesh of the cage wall. He looked at the faces around him. They were covered in grey dust, streaked with sweat and tears. They didn't look like soldiers. They looked exactly like what they were: a terrified, traumatized workforce pushed past the breaking point. He closed his eyes, feeling the vibration of the elevator in his boots. He thought about his apartment back on Earth, the smell of his morning coffee, the annoying hum of his refrigerator. It felt like a fever dream, a lifetime away. The man who lived in that apartment died the moment he crushed an alien skull with a steel bolt. We aren't going to win. Caleb thought the cynicism settling back into his bones, cold and heavy. They have a fleet in orbit. They have kinetic bombardments. They have plasma rifles. We have pickaxes. But as he opened his eyes and looked at the heavy iron tools gripped tightly in hundreds of shaking, blistered hands, a different thought pushed through the despair. We aren't going to win, but we are going to make them bleed so badly they'll never look at a human without flinching again. The elevator slowed. The light filtering through the mesh shifted from the dim, dusty yellow of the mine to the harsh, sterile, blinding white of the Vael upper facility. The brakes engaged with a massive squeal of metal. The cage stopped. "Keep your heads down," Hannah whispered, gripping her wrench. "When the doors open, we don't stop moving. If you fall, you die. If you stop, you die." The heavy blast doors in front of them hissed, unlocking with a series of heavy mechanical clunks. Caleb tightened his grip on his pickaxe. His knuckles ached. His throat burned. He took a deep breath of the sterile, filtered air of the alien hub. The doors slid open, revealing a pristine, gleaming white corridor. Two veiled technicians wearing lightweight tunics and carrying data slates stopped dead in their tracks, turning to look at the elevator. They expected to see a maintenance crew, or a load of silica ore. Instead, they saw 300 blood-soaked feral humans standing in a cage holding iron bars. Caleb locked eyes with the nearest technician. The alien's smooth face remained blank, but its large, dark eyes widened slightly in an undeniable flash of primal recognition. It was the look of an entity realizing a fraction of a second too late that it had walked into a predator's den. Caleb stepped out of the cage, his boots leaving thick, bloody prints on the immaculate white floor. "Now," Caleb said. The swarm surged forward. The two veiled technicians didn't even have time to raise their hands. The human wave crashed into them with the messy, uncoordinated brutality of a collapsing dam. There were no battle cries, just the ragged, wet sounds of desperate breathing and the sickening thud of heavy iron meeting fragile ceramic and bone. Caleb was pushed forward by the sheer momentum of the crowd behind him. He stumbled over one of the downed aliens, his boot slipping on the sudden slickness of clear ammonia blood smearing across the pristine white floor tiles. He caught his balance against a gleaming, polished bulkhead. It felt cold and smooth, like the display counter at a high-end electronics store. Now there was a bloody handprint smeared right across it. "Keep moving!" Hannah yelled. Her voice was cracking a harsh rasp, tearing from a throat parched by silica dust and adrenaline. "Don't let them seal the blast doors. Find the control spire." They poured down the wide, sterile corridor. Overhead, the recessed lighting flickered, struggling to adjust to the sudden influx of chaotic biological mass. The air here smelled heavily of filtered oxygen and a faint, citrus-like antiseptic. It made Caleb's stomach churn. It smelled like the dentist's office. It smelled like the place where they put you under before cutting you open. Alarms finally began to blare. They weren't the loud, screaming sirens of human movies. They were low, rhythmic, vibrating thrums that rattled the fillings in Caleb's teeth and made the burned flesh on his neck throb in time with the pulse. A heavy partition door 50 yards ahead began to slide shut, descending from the ceiling. "Run!" shouted a man named David, a former high school gym teacher whose left arm was hanging limp and dislocated from the riot below. A dozen people sprinted, throwing themselves under the descending slab of steel. Most made it. The last man, a young kid in a torn grey t-shirt, tripped on his oversized work boots. He scrambled, pushing his chest under the door, but the pneumatic pistons didn't possess safety sensors for biological anomalies. The door kept coming. It pinned his legs at the shins. The sound of his bones snapping echoed down the hall, followed instantly by a shrill, piercing scream. Caleb reached the door just as it locked into the floor. He dropped to his knees, grabbing the kid's shoulders through the narrow gap. 2 other women grabbed him as well, pulling frantically, but it was useless. The door was flush with the floor, sealing the boy's lower half on the other side. "Leave him," Hannah said, grabbing the back of Caleb's shirt and yanking him upright. "We can't just... Look!" she barked, pointing down the hall. From panels in the ceiling, automated security turrets were unfolding. Sleek, matte-white cylinders dropping down on silent servo motors. They didn't fire bullets. They fired concentrated thermal pulses. Zip-crack. A pulse of blinding blue heat snapped through the air, hitting a woman in the chest. She didn't even scream. The moisture in her torso flash-boiled the concussive expansion of steam, blowing her backward into the wall. The smell of cooked meat and burned hair instantly overpowered the citrus antiseptic. Panic rippled through the mob. People shoved against each other, slipping on the polished floor, diving behind decorative metallic pillars that offered no real cover. Caleb flattened himself against a wall, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The terror was paralyzing. His hands shook so violently he dropped his kinetic pickaxe. It clattered loudly on the floor. He squeezed his eyes shut, pressing the side of his face against the cold metal wall. "I'm going to die here," he thought. "I survived the mine just to get cooked in a hallway." "The panels!" someone screamed. "Break the panels!" David, the gym teacher, hoisted a heavy wrench with his one good arm and hurled it at a recessed glass panel on the wall beneath the turrets. The glass shattered. Sparks showered outward as the cooling lines ruptured. The nearest turret twitched its targeting laser tracking erratically before powering down with a sad, dying hum. It was a primitive solution to advanced technology. Break the plumbing starve the machine. "Tear the walls apart!" Hannah roared. The mob surged again, not forward but sideways. They took their pickaxes, their iron bars, and their bare hands to the pristine corridors of the vile upper facility. They smashed the elegant lighting fixtures. They tore the climate control grates from the floorboards. They swung heavy iron tools into the delicate, crystalline touch screens that lined the walls. It was absolute destructive vandalism on a massive scale. Caleb picked up his pickaxe. His arms felt like lead, but he swung it into a data conduit running along the baseboard. The iron bit deeply severing a thick bundle of fiber optics. The corridor plunged into a flickering, strobing twilight. They weren't fighting an army. They were a virus spreading through the veins of a highly ordered organism, causing systemic failure through sheer, messy, unpredictable damage. The turrets reliant on a perfectly balanced local network began to misfire. One shot into the ceiling, bringing down a shower of acoustic tiling. Another simply locked up smoking. They pushed past the automated defenses, stepping over the smoking bodies of their own dead. The death toll was climbing, but the humans didn't break. The vile logic dictated that 20% casualties would result in total psychological collapse and surrender. But humanity was no longer doing math. They were doing violence. They breached the central control spire 20 minutes later. It was a massive circular room, encased in thick, transparent aluminum, overlooking the sprawling, grey, cratered surface of the moon. Outside, massive atmospheric domes dotted the landscape like glass blisters connected by umbilical transit tubes. In orbit, the dark, sleek shapes of Vale frigates hung silently against the starry void. The room was filled with dozens of sunken control pits manned by Vale technicians. In the center, standing on a raised dais, was the Overseer Prime. It wore a tunic woven from threads of spun silver, marking its high administrative rank. When the reinforced doors gave way under the repeated concussive blows of 20 kinetic pickaxes, the room froze. The Overseer Prime turned, its dark, fathomless eyes swept over the mob, pouring into its sanctuary. 300 humans, covered in soot, drenched in blood, breathing heavily, their eyes wide and feral in the dim light. Hannah and Caleb stepped onto the dais. Caleb's hands were slick with sweat. He gripped his pickaxe so tightly his fingers were completely numb. "Cease," the Overseer Prime said. Its voice did not come from a translator box, but from the room's overarching audio system, booming with an artificial synthesized authority. "You are in violation of standard planetary protocols. Further aggression will result in total orbital sterilization." "Turn off the network," Hannah said. Her voice was quiet, raspy, but it carried in the dead silence of the room. "The collars, all of them on the planet. Turn them off." "Negative," the Overseer Prime responded, its face completely devoid of expression. It was processing a logistical error, not negotiating with an enemy. Biological units do not dictate parameters. The planetary garrison has been mobilized. You will be contained. You will be processed. "There is no garrison," Caleb found himself saying. He stepped forward, his boots leaving dark smudges on the glowing floor of the dais. "You don't have soldiers here. You have IT guys and automated turrets, because you never needed soldiers before." The Overseer tilted its head slightly, an almost imperceptible gesture of calculation. "A kinetic strike from orbit requires 3 minutes to initiate. If you do not return to the subterranean sectors, this facility will be vaporized." "Do it!" a woman in the crowd yelled. "Fucking do it!" The Vahale looked at the crowd, genuine confusion finally fracturing its perfect composure. "Destruction of this facility includes your own termination. This action is devoid of self-preservation. It is mathematically invalid." "We don't care," Caleb said. And as the words left his mouth, he realized they were entirely true. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in his stomach, but it was eclipsed by a profound, exhaustion-fueled spite. He looked at the Overseer standing in its pristine silver tunic, trying to balance a spreadsheet of life and death, entirely failing to comprehend the rabid dog it had backed into a corner. "You think we're negotiating?" Caleb muttered. "We're not." He didn't swing at the alien. He swung his pickaxe directly into the central holographic projector, embedded in the dais. The iron head smashed through the crystalline surface. A shower of blinding white sparks erupted, scorching Caleb's arms. The Overseer stepped back, its hands raising in a sudden jerky motion of alarm. "System integrity compromised," a female automated voice droned over the speakers. "Break it all," Hannah commanded. The mob descended on the control pits. The veiled technicians didn't fight back. They cowered, trying to shield their consoles with their bodies, but they were swarmed, pulled away, and beaten with whatever heavy objects were at hand. Caleb ignored the violence around him. He knelt by the shattered central console. Below the smashed projector, thick, pulsating cooling lines and fiber-optic trunks snaked down into the floor. This was the nervous system of the facility, the planetary network hub. "Hannah!" Caleb shouted over the din of breaking glass and screaming aliens. "The main trunk, it's hardwired." She was beside him a second later, her face smeared with soot, bleeding from a cut on her forehead. She looked down into the exposed circuitry. She pulled the jagged, blood-stained metal shard from her pocket, the same shard she had used to short out her collar. "It's a closed loop," she muttered, tracing the thickest power cable. "The cooling system runs on liquid nitrogen. If the thermal regulators lose power, the servers melt down to slag. The collars lose their network ping." "But the fail-safe," Caleb said, his throat tight. "If the network drops abruptly, do the collars detonate?" Hannah looked at him. Her eyes were empty, hollowed out by too much trauma in too short a time. "I don't know," she whispered. Maybe we kill every slave on this rock." Caleb looked at the sky outside the window. He could see the faint, glowing dots of other atmospheric domes across the moon's surface. Millions of people. Millions of collars. "If we don't do it, they die in the mines anyway," David said, stepping up behind them. He dropped his heavy wrench on the deck. He was pale, sweating profusely, shock setting in from his dislocated shoulder. "Do it. Pull the plug." Hannah wedged the metal shard into the seam of the primary thermal regulator box. She looked at Caleb. Caleb raised his kinetic pickaxe. He didn't hesitate. He brought the heavy iron head down on the back of the metal shard, driving it deep into the circuitry. A deafening crack ripped through the room. A geyser of freezing white liquid nitrogen erupted from the severed line, spraying across the dais. Caleb threw his arms up, turning his face away, as the blistering cold mist hit his exposed skin, burning like fire. Deep beneath the floorboards, a heavy, vibrating hum suddenly pitched upward into a mechanical scream. Thermal runaway detected. The automated voice blared, no longer calm, but stuttering and panicked. "Network collapse imminent. 5, 4. Caleb grabbed Hannah's arm, dragging her back from the freezing spray. They stumbled down the steps of the dais. 3, 2. The lights in the control spire died. The holographic displays vanished. The hum of the oxygen cyclers sputtered and stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a severed nerve. Around Caleb's neck, the heavy dead iron of his collar suddenly popped. A tiny internal lock disengaged with a sharp click. He reached up. His trembling fingers brushed the metal. He pulled slightly, and the collar separated into 2 halves, falling away from his blistered, scarred throat. It hit the floor with a dull, heavy clatter. All around the room the same sound echoed. Click, clatter, click, clatter. 300 heavy iron collars hitting the polished deck. They were free. The freezing mist of the ruptured liquid nitrogen line settled over the control spire, coating the shattered glass and ruined consoles in a thin, fragile layer of white frost. The hiss of the escaping gas had faded into a low, dying sputter. It didn't end with a grand cinematic victory parade. There was no swelling orchestral score, no sun breaking through the clouds, and no collective cheer from the masses. It ended with math. Caleb sat on the floor, his back pressed against the curved frosted glass of a primary workstation. The emergency lighting bathed the room in a dull, bruised purple. He watched his own breath plume in the rapidly cooling air. The silence was absolute, heavy, and deeply unsettling. For 3 days, his reality had been a sensory assault of grinding drills, snapping bones, synthesized voices, and screaming. Now the quiet felt like a physical pressure in his ears. Outside the massive transparent aluminum windows, the Vial fleet was moving. They weren't scrambling in a panic. They weren't deploying drop ships filled with heavily armed shock troops to retake the spire. Slowly, with that same agonizing, fluid grace that defined their every movement, the dark, sleek frigates were breaking their stationary orbits. One by one, their sublight engines flared a brilliant, sterile, icy blue against the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the void. They were leaving. The Vial Empire was not vindictive. They were not capable of anger or pride or a desire for vengeance. They were the ultimate accountants of the cosmos. Humanity had just proven to be a catastrophic investment. To retake the moon would require diverting military assets from active expansion fronts. It would require spending billions of credits to pacify a localized workforce that had already deliberately destroyed the very mining infrastructure they were brought here to operate. You don't spend $1 million to fix a broken hammer. You throw the hammer away. "They're actually leaving," Hannah said. She was sitting a few feet away, her legs pulled tight to her chest. She had found a torn strip of a pristine white veil tunic and wrapped it blindly around her bleeding forehead. The fabric was already soaked through a stark, wet crimson. She stared out the window, her eyes tracking the retreating ships with a hollow, haunted intensity. Caleb didn't look at the ships. He was staring at the floor. Specifically, he was staring at the heavy, matte black iron half-circle resting an inch from his right boot. His collar. When the main network had collapsed, the failsafe hadn't triggered. The collars hadn't detonated. Deprived of their central signal, the internal analog locks had simply disengaged. Millions of heavy iron rings all across the moon had clicked open and fallen to the dirt. Caleb reached up with a trembling hand. His fingers hovered over his throat. The phantom weight of the metal was still there, pressing down on his collarbones, choking his airway. He forced his hand down, lightly brushing the skin. He flinched. The burn was horrific, the flesh bubbled tight and weeping clear fluid. It was a permanent brand, a barcode written into his anatomy. 72 hours ago, he was a logistics manager. He complained about the price of avocados. He argued with his landlord about a leaky faucet. He worried about his credit score. Now his cuticles were caked with the dried ammonia-scented blood of an alien overseer. He had beaten a living creature to death with an iron bolt. He had done it without hesitation, and worse, he had felt a savage, euphoric relief while doing it. The man who had worried about avocados was dead. Caleb mourned him for a fraction of a second, then let him go. That man wouldn't survive the week. A sharp burst of static crackled through the room, making Caleb violently flinch. Hannah had crawled over to the secondary communications array. The screen was cracked, but it still had emergency battery power. She twisted a dial. Voices spilled into the silent room. It wasn't a unified chorus of triumph. It was a chaotic, terrifying wave of localized panic. Need a medic in Sector 4. We have 30 people bleeding out from the stampede. Doors are open, but the air scrubbers are off. How do we turn the scrubbers on? Oh God, I can't breathe. Oh, they're dead. They're all dead. Miller is dead. Someone tell me what to do. The food dispensers are locked. We broke the terminal. Freedom was messy. Millions of traumatized, starving, exhausted humans were wandering up from the dark tunnels, blinking in the harsh, artificial light of the surface domes. They had no leadership, no structure, and no idea how to operate the life support systems of the alien facility they had just violently conquered. "Turn it off!" David groaned from the floor. The former gym teacher was lying flat on his back, heavily sedated by a handful of painkillers they had looted from a shattered medical station. His dislocated shoulder had been brutally popped back into its socket by Hannah, and he was pale, sweating profusely, shivering in the cold air. "Leave it on," Caleb rasped. His voice sounded like grinding stones. "We need to know who's alive." David turned his head, looking at the distant, shrinking lights of the Vale fleet. "We're dead anyway," he whispered, a deep, nihilistic despair settling over his features. "We're stuck on a dead rock. We have no ships. We have no way home. They didn't retreat, Caleb. They just left us in a locked cage to starve." Caleb looked at the blood smeared across his own knuckles. He felt a bone-deep exhaustion that bordered on physical sickness. His stomach was a hollow, cramping void. His lungs ached with every breath. He wanted nothing more than to close his eyes and slip into a coma. But as he listened to the panicked voices on the radio, the cold, heavy spite that had kept him moving for 3 days began to shift. It stopped being a wild, feral flame and hardened into something dense, cold and heavy. Pragmatism. Caleb placed his hands on the console and forced himself to stand. His knees popped. His muscles screamed in protest. He looked down at David. We aren't starving today, Caleb said. The cynicism was completely gone, replaced by a flat, terrifying absolute. We have the physical infrastructure of a planetary mining hub. We have hydroponics bays. We have atmospheric synthesizers. We don't know how to run them, David argued weakly. Then we figure it out, Caleb replied, stepping over his discarded collar. He walked toward the massive window, looking down at the sprawling, cratered surface of the moon below. We are a species of engineers and mechanics, David. We reverse engineer the doors. We hotwire the air scrubbers. We fix the plumbing. Hannah stood up, joining him at the window. She pressed her hand against the cold glass. And the dead? She asked quietly. We bury them, Caleb said. We pile up the grey bastards and we burn them. We take their suits, we take their tools, and we take their tech. He looked out at the stars. The vile ships were entirely gone now, swallowed by the infinite black. The silence of the universe felt less like a threat and more like an open challenge. And then, Hannah asked, turning her head to look at him. Her eyes were still hollow, but a tiny, sharp spark of defiance had returned to them. And then, Caleb breathed, tracing the blistered scar on his neck. We figure out how to build a ship, because I want to go home. And if they get in our way again... He looked down at his blood-stained hands, closing them into tight, aching fists. We break their fucking knees. It was a deeply imperfect, ugly promise. It was born of severe trauma and fueled by a stubborn, irrational, uniquely human malice. The Vale Empire had spent 1,000 years reading the statistics of the galaxy, assuming every species could eventually be broken into compliance. They just didn't realize that some species don't break. They shatter, and the remaining pieces are entirely too sharp to hold. If you felt the heat of the rebellion and the grit of the mines in this story, don't stop here. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss the rest of this epic HFY saga. The Vael are about to learn exactly why humanity is the worst species in the galaxy to enslave. Drop a comment below. How would you have shorted out the collar? Share this video with a fellow sci-fi fan, and stay tuned for the explosive continuation. Humanity stands tall.